Hello, my name's Anneli Aliaga. I'm a British Bolivian student at the University of Cambridge. I've just finished the MPhil in Latin American Studies, and I'm hoping to continue at PhD level and continue looking at decolonizing culture in the Latin American context, and more specifically cinema. So today I will be presenting my master's dissertation, which was written a few months back now. But yes, I'm going to share my screen for my PowerPoint presentation. Okay. And also, I would just like to take advantage of this small break to thank Sophia and Michael and all the translators for making this discussion on decolonizing art possible. So thank you very much. So here's the title of my master's dissertation, titled Decolonizing Film, Representations of Indigenous Injustice and Insurgency in the Cinema of Jorge Sanginés and the Grupo Ucamau. So I decided to base my research on this political Bolivian cinema group who are still active to this day. They started in the 1960s, Jorge Sanginés being the principal filmmaker. And the group are responsible for having created the first ever feature-length films in Quechua and Aymara, the two most dominant indigenous languages of the Andes. The cinema group was founded by Jorge Sanginés, and they were key participants and instigators behind the surge of a militant and socially conscious direction for Latin American cinema, which later became known as the New Latin American Cinema Movement. Before I start my presentation, I feel it's important to contextualize this decolonial form of art within Latin America's history of cinema. I'll then outline some of the research questions I set for myself, how I tackled them, how I structured my 15,000 word project, and finally, I'll discuss what my reflections and conclusions were. Given the 20-minute time frame that we have been given, I also feel it's important for me to share some of the extracts of the audiovisual material I've been working with. So hopefully if we have enough time, I'll do that. But if not, apologies, and I'm happy to send the links of the YouTube videos later on. Okay. So let's start off by contextualizing this cinema movement. So the cinema movement, the New Latin American Cinema Movement, was initiated in the 1960s, and it was in response to the extensive struggles associated with the underdevelopment that was plaguing Latin American nations due to the colonial legacy. The movement strived to create a revolutionary type of cinema, and it used film as an instrument of social awareness to kind of expose national realities. In this sense, it empowered popular sectors by giving their concerns a platform and providing an anti-colonial critique of the existing social and racial hierarchies in the region. The Grupo Ucamau fits into this visual regime of revolutionary militancy because it was founded on the need to expose national realities and uplift subaltern voices and narratives during a particularly turbulent period of time in Bolivia's history, the 1960s. So a ruling white elite, US intervention, conservative authoritarian rule, and economic instability oppressed Bolivia's indigenous peasantry, who were the continuous victims of racism, persecution, and political and social marginalization. The Grupo Ucamau sided with the popular sectors against the state and created films that publicly denounced imperialist and state crimes against these indigenous populations. So third cinema is often a term associated with the New Latin American Cinema Movement, and Sanginés and the Grupo Ucamau's cinema can be seen within this perspective as well. It was born and forms a part of the New Latin American Cinema Movement, but it's also been used to describe revolutionary filmmaking in Africa and Asia too. So that's how it kind of extends beyond the region of Latin America. So the term was coined by Fernando Solanas and Octavio Quetino's Film Theory Manifesto, which was written in 1969 toward a third cinema. And it involves various aesthetic solutions used to create this kind of militant revolutionary cinema for the marginalized sectors. And at the heart of this cinema is the need to decolonize, to subvert dominant productions of knowledge in cinema, such as the Hollywood model, and instead to put forward counter-hegemonic epistemes. So here we have a quotation from the manifesto. So third cinema is, in our opinion, the cinema that recognizes in that struggle the most gigantic cultural, scientific, and artistic manifestation of our time. In a word, the decolonization of culture. Right, so now we're moving on to my research questions that I set. First of all, what does decolonizing cinema involve? So I was inspired to look at the decolonization of cinema, not only because of third cinema philosophy, but also because the rise of self-representative indigenous media in Latin America as a whole, but more specifically, I'm looking at Bolivia. And Freya Shiwi also is looking in this direction. She describes this form of media as the ultimate form of a decolonial cinema, one that directly confronts the anti-colonial gaze, deviates completely from Western models of culture where indigenous peoples can have audiovisual autonomy and authorship over their representations. So indigenous media is an alternative production of knowledge based on indigenous modes of knowing and storytelling. Quote unquote, I suggest that decolonization at the beginning of the 21st century focuses not only on the struggle over territory, legislation, and political representation, but also, perhaps more importantly, on epistemes. In other words, indigenous movements recognize that representation, audiovisual, literary, and scholarly, entails the power to shape lived reality. There is an urgent need to decolonize nature. So we must remember that cinema's foundations are firmly rooted in the imperial mission of European colonization. It was an extension of the long-winded history of the production of colonial representations, which served to further oppress colonized subjects and justify the colonial project. So colonial cinema prioritized hegemonic, Eurocentric epistemologies by perverting, exoticizing, and demonizing the non-West, creating unfavorable and debilitating misrepresentations of colonized subjects as part of these cinematic narratives. Drawing for the works of scholars who work on indigenous media, such as Shiwi, as I mentioned before, and Charlotte Gleghorn, I look at various aspects in the cinematographic process that can lead to this decolonization of cinema. I believe that a decolonized cinema is one that is free of racist stereotypes, typically used against subaltern subjects, and instead promotes the production of favorable and empowering images of indigeneity in this context, for example. Self-representative or collaborative filmmaking projects that give subaltern subjects narrative agency, and cinema aesthetics and a cinematic form that moves away from Hollywood models to complement indigenous worldviews. So what does this decolonial cinema hope to achieve? Well, decolonizing cinema is just one of the aspects that forms a part of a wider mission to decolonize culture and epistemologies. It links to this idea of subverting dominant Western productions of knowledge, which is where I'll make the connection in my research to a body of decolonial thought led by Walter Mignolo, who speaks of the need to de-Westernize and de-link from the colonial matrix. In the context of Bolivia, with the reinstatement of the mass government under Luis Arce, events that took place fairly recently, there's now a Ministry of Decolonization that's under the Ministry of Cultures, which forms a part of the overarching government aim to decolonize Bolivia. So to what extent can the Grupo Ucamau cinema more specifically be read as decolonial? This was one of my main research questions. So with this background and this decolonial mission, or Bolivia's decolonial mission in mind, it's important for me to ask how Ucamau links and contributes to this process, with a particular focus on empowering representations of indigenous insurgency, but also drawing on the filmmaking practices outlined by San Ginés in his various film theory manifestos and the form aesthetics that the group use. I'll argue that their cinema is one of the first examples of a decolonial cinema, kind of based on the framework that I just outlined. However, throughout my research and the choice of films I decided to use as case studies to prove this, I also found a parallel line of argument which addresses the evolution of their cinema and its relationship with the Bolivian state and the respective historical political climates in which these case study films were made in. So this leads me on to discussing the choice of films that I made. So the research questions I've outlined will be attended to by looking at these two films in the Grupo Camões cinematographic trajectory. Jauar Maiku on the left-hand side, which was created in 1969, and Insurgentes, which is one of their more recent films produced in 2012. They were produced during vastly different socio-political periods in Bolivian history, and these films are a useful point of comparison in connection to the decolonial framework I outlined earlier. They signpost evolutionary changes in the Grupo Camões philosophy, revolutionary cinematography, and demonstrate how cinematographic decolonial strategies respond to historical and political contexts. So next we can see my, here we go. Next we can see my table of contents. So my dissertation, as you can see, is structured rather simply. Chapter 1 traces back to one of the Grupo Camões' first films, Jauar Maiku, translated as Blood of the Condor. It was created at a time of political instability in Bolivia. The film recounts and denounces a US interventionist crime concerning the forced sterilization of Quechua populations or Quechua women in the Altiplano. The film marks the combative attitude that was shaped by and helped to shape the start of the new Latin American cinema movement. Despite the film's success, however, and for the motives that will be discussed or that are discussed in my dissertation, the Grupo Camões' decolonial intentions in Jauar Maiku were hindered by the film's form and the filmmaking practices that were chosen when working with the indigenous non-actors, as the group came to realize their cinematic approach was steeped in Eurocentrism and paternalistic thought. So they still used a very linear structure in this film. And as I discuss in this chapter, there were a lot of indigenous viewers who didn't understand the linear narrative because it was obviously based on a very Eurocentric form of storytelling. So chapter 2 on Insurgentes observes how some of the blunders from Jauar Maiku were addressed and amended in order to further decolonize their cinema. At the end of the day, you have to remember that the Grupo Camões, they wanted indigenous viewers to be their main critics and their main viewers. This chapter takes a leap into the modern day filmmaking culture of the Grupo Camões with one of their latest films, Insurgentes, which is a hybrid fiction documentary on Bolivia's anti-colonial struggles throughout history. So the Bolivian newspaper Opinión describes Insurgentes as un proyecto radicalmente distinto al resto de su obra. So it's very different compared to Jauar Maiku. For a start, the scholar David Wood has commented on the Cinema Collective's excitement of finally having produced a film which was supported by an Indianista government previous to Insurgentes. Most of Camões' films were made during right-wing military dictatorships, and they were not supported by the state. Although scholarship tends to focus on San Ginés and the Grupo Camões' earlier films, Insurgentes represents a shift towards a new direction for the group, who no longer demonize the current state through their cinema. The Grupo Camões' decolonizing agenda molds into Bolivia's broader mission of decolonization, and it actually complements the mass government's visions of the restoration of an indigenous state. So one of the questions I asked myself for this section is, does this wider governmental decolonial process, as well as the surge of self-representative indigenous cinema practices, complicate the uniqueness and the relevance of the Grupo Camões' decolonial intentions? So this chapter considers the evolutionary changes in aesthetics and form that have been integrated into the Bolivian Cinema Collective's modern works, and also discusses the politics of representation. Finally, the chapter lays the foundation for the conclusion's discussion on how the Grupo Camões cinema can continue to move forward in light of the recent political and cultural climate in Bolivia. So you can also see the subsections that I created in these 2 chapters. Okay, one of the main points of tension which I found in my research was this argument on the politics of representation. So post-colonial theory, such as the body of thought led by Edward Said and Gayatri Spivak, drew my attention to the question of representing others, which has also been widely discussed in the context of visual culture. So these questions, who has the right to represent and speak on behalf of whom? So despite Sangines's participatory cross-cultural efforts, it's useful to question how this cinema group's work compares to the rise of self-representative practices in indigenous cinema, and to also look at the filmmaker's positionality. So throughout my dissertation, I continuously address the fact that the Grupo Camao are a collective of middle-class mestizos in Bolivia. I ask myself, and I open up this question to all the viewers, can representational practices, such as those emanated in the Grupo Camao's most recent films, challenge racial and social power asymmetries with as much weight as contemporary practices of self-representation, as Shiri and Gleghorn discuss in indigenous media? Okay, so I think we're okay for time. So I hope this works. And I'm going to show a bit of audiovisual material. This is the first film, Yawar Maiku. Oops. Okay, this is not going to work. Okay. This one also isn't going to collaborate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send these YouTube links separately, and perhaps Sophia and Michael can distribute these links, and you can watch them in your own time, and perhaps they can form a part of the discussion. Okay, let's move on to the final reflections and the conclusion. So the main conclusion that I was able to draw from my dissertation was that the evolution of the Grupo Camao's cinematography from Yawar Maiku in the 60s to Insurgentes in the 21st century confirms the fact that the Bolivian cinema collective deepened its commitments to decolonizing cinema over time. Using the decolonial film framework I outlined, I was able to measure how, in general, the Grupo Camao exemplified a continuous effort throughout the course of their cinematographic trajectory to subvert our typical colonial, racist, and pejorative tropes of indigenous peoples. However, in response to the tensions relating to the politics of representation, I believe the Grupo Camao's positionality and privilege in connection to the indigenous subjects with whom they work with will continue to be a point of tension for as long as the colonial legacy's social and racial frameworks are upheld in Bolivia. It would be naive, however, to ignore the group's efforts in tackling this power asymmetry. After all, their decolonial cinematic intentions, the collaborative and participatory filmmaking practices in accordance with Andean ideas of social democracy, the way in which their cinematography embraces Andean socio-temporal concepts such as that of Naira Pacha, their sensitive and favorable representations of Quechua Aymara subjects, and their willingness to engage in epistemological and cross-cultural dialogues with Bolivia's popular sectors are all indicators that the Grupo Camao acknowledge and attempt to neutralize this power asymmetry. I found that the most striking evolution in the cinematography of the Grupo Camao is their development of an increasingly intelligible Andean filmic form and aesthetic. So their latest films demonstrate a specifically Andean film grammar that prioritizes cyclical indigenous models of storytelling as opposed to Western linear models of storytelling. So by focusing on the evolutionary cinematographic changes between Yawar Maiku and Insurgentes, this dissertation uncovers how the Grupo Camao have a perennial quest to seek an epistemological, ideological, and cultural closeness to the Andean cosmos. So a detailed observation of the Grupo Camao's cinematic trajectory, analysing the cluster of films which they produced in between Yawar Maiku and Insurgentes, was unfortunately beyond the scope of this dissertation. Nonetheless, it has opened up a possibility for further study, and perhaps has inspired me and others to kind of look more closely at this cinema collective. So thank you very much for listening, and I think that's everything.